crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Thank you, Ian. How many of us have ever been so hungry that the scent of food made you salivate? That happened. Many of us. How many have ever gone for more than 2 days without any food at all? A few. How many have eaten leftovers for more than 3 meals in a row? Lots of folks. So, a number of years ago, I overheard the friend of a friend humble bragging that her poor husband had had to eat a sandwich for lunch every day this week. I was confused. I like sandwiches. Much of the time, I would have them for dinner as well as lunch. 2 slices of bread, 2 slices of lunch meat, a slice of cheese, a leaf of lettuce. If I'm home, a slice of tomato. You can't do it for work because it gets soggy during the morning. And 1 medium square of rich dark chocolate was the perfect lunch. Less expensive and less unhealthy than most of the fast food I would eat otherwise. And I do get that, I did buy different kinds of meat and I did buy different cheeses. My step-grandfather took a bologna sandwich in his lunchbox every weekday for 20 years. I might get pretty bored by the very same thing every day for 20 years. So I have a little sympathy for the Hebrew people on their exodus out of Egypt. It is likely you might hear the full story at a Seder meal this Friday or Saturday. I will focus on a few of the details today. After the Israelites had been enslaved and oppressed for many years, God sent Moses to liberate them. Pharaoh would not cooperate, so God sent 10 plagues. Eventually, Pharaoh relented and allowed the Israelites to go free. Except he changed his mind and chased after them after all. And then Moses parted the Red Sea. The Israelites escaped. Pharaoh's army was drowned. You've seen the movie, probably. Jewish families have been telling this story every spring for 2,500 years. And by doing so, they create and sustain their identity as a people. They remind themselves of their commitment to freedom and of the benefits and perils of being God's chosen people. Now, there's at least a little bit of a caveat here. There is no record of Egypt having enslaved any Jews. They had lots of slaves, don't get me wrong. This particular thing is not an actual fact. Turns out that the word for Egypt and the word for a narrow place were very similar. And so that's probably what was happening. And a narrow place is the same kind of idiom that we use between a rock and a hard place. So instead of being specifically Egypt, the Israelites were talking about a place where they were probably enslaved by some powerful people nearby, and they took some risks to escape that bondage, only to end up wandering in the desert with too little water and food. I can imagine that happening to me, and I can imagine I might get cranky from hunger and thirst and get all passive-aggressive and say something to Moses like, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, taking us out of Egypt?" Which is what they said in Exodus 14:11. And 2 chapters later, the children of Israel said unto them, "Would to God we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the fleshpots, when we did eat bread to the full. For ye have brought us forth into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger." We like to kvetch once in a while, don't we? Fleshpots is an interesting word in there. And it has come to mean something different than it did to the people 2,500 years ago. Please don't Google fleshpots when you get home. But what it meant at that point was pots of flesh, pots of meat, pots of fish. Now, these were oppressed people. They didn't have a whole lot of meat in their diet, but they could at least smell the flesh pots of Egypt cooking nearby. And while they're eating their bread, at least they could smell the flesh pots of Egypt nearby. And when you're sitting out in the desert and eating, I don't know, scorpion soup, maybe the memory of a big piece of bread and that nice smell of meat was a little better. Kind of makes me think of the story for all ages with the well-fed but chained dog and the hungry but free wolf. At either end of the spectrum, the other looks increasingly good. When you haven't eaten anything for 4 days, maybe you can work your way out of that chain eventually. Let's go ahead and try it. When you have been well fed for a year but never made it past that little circle you've managed to tread into the yard, I'll go a few meals without having eaten and go see the world. Becky read us the Starhawk quote, "Community means strength that joins our strength to do the work that needs to be done. Arms to hold us when we falter, a circle of healing, a circle of friends, someplace where we can be free." I don't think the dog or the wolf has real freedom. One is chained, one is bound by hunger and loneliness. Those in community creating this ever-changing balance of support and restraint have real freedom, or at least have a better opportunity to achieve it. That's why it's nice to have an ingathering of new members on the same day that we talk about Passover. We get to talk about freedom and how to balance our personal freedoms with the greater freedoms of living in spiritual community. And of course, none of us are perfect. We are all cracked. That's how the light gets in. We have inherent worth and dignity. We are people with strong opinions and a fairly wide variety of opinions about all sorts of things. It's not always easy to balance all of that in community. It is a real challenge to help all of us understand you are heard and valued, that we are heard and valued, even if the rest of the congregation chooses to do or say something of which we disapprove. We don't want dissenting voices to feel unheard, but we don't want them to block consensus either. And that balance is struck every day differently as we go forward. In this room and in this Zoom, I am clearly and vehemently for legal, safe abortion. I would like it and birth control to be free. I have friends and congregants in this room who believe differently than I do. I support gun control and the right of people to own guns. I have friends and colleagues and people in this room and this Zoom who disagree from a variety of angles on that issue. I try to support the movement for Black lives. I have family members, friends, colleagues, and people in this room and this Zoom who understand the struggle for civil rights and against racism in many, many different ways. I work hard at supporting the LGBTQ plus community, and there are a variety of understanding those identities and strategies for equality, and more on that in a few weeks. At a previous congregation, one of the local groups delivered a couple of signs for us, for our members to put in their yards and maybe at the church. I think it was probably the Quakers. It sounds like them. The sign said, "Torture is immoral." And as they dropped them off, they just put it in the grass outside the front door. Now, this was well off the road. Nobody could see it unless they were trying to enter the church. But of course, the first person to come was someone who disagreed that torture was immoral and was quite incensed that the church would put that up. And he probably had a point about whether or not we put things like that without at least having a conversation. But I'm also pretty confident that the vast majority of people believed that torture is immoral. It's hard to balance our freedom to speak up and say what we believe and supporting others' ability to do the same. And perhaps the most difficult thing, sometimes time just happens. And you'll come to church one morning after having coming for 40 years, and the people that are sitting around you now are very different from those when you started, and believe different things and say different things. That loss is real, and it is sometimes agonizing. Navigating our differences can be difficult. I believe it can be worth it, but it's difficult. Let us not slink off alone like the wolf in our story. Let us not mandate certain beliefs or orthodoxy, chaining each other like the dog. Let us not attack each other and fight over spiritual morsels. Let us rather find a way to coexist and thereby strengthen ourselves and our community. So may we be. And that turned out